The rain hammered against the windows of the Neverland Ranch like bullets from heaven. Lightning split the California sky, illuminating the sprawling estate in brief, ghostly flashes. Inside the main house, Michael Jackson sat alone in his private studio, his fingers dancing across the piano keys as he worked on a new melody. The music flowed through him like water, each note carrying the weight of his troubled soul. But tonight was different. Tonight, something in the air felt electric, dangerous. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil that had been building in Michael's life for months. The media circus never stopped spinning, the accusations never ceased, and the pressure felt like a mountain crushing down on his chest. He had retreated to his sanctuary, hoping to find peace in the one place that had always brought him comfort, his music. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, its deep voice echoing through the dimly lit room. Michael's hands paused on the keys as he heard something that made his blood freeze. Through the howling wind and crashing thunder, he could hear it clearly, a child screaming. His heart began to race as he stood up from the piano bench, his silk shirt clinging to his skin despite the cool air. The scream came again, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the storm like a knife. Michael's instincts kicked in immediately. Throughout his life, he had always been drawn to help children, to protect the innocent. It was something deeper than compassion. It was a calling that burned in his very soul. He rushed to the tall windows that overlooked the valley below. The rain made it nearly impossible to see, but another flash of lightning revealed something that made his stomach drop. Down at the bottom of the hill, where the winding road curved around the creek, he could see the twisted metal of what looked like a car accident. The vehicle had clearly skidded off the wet pavement and crashed into the rocky embankment. Without hesitation, Michael grabbed a flashlight from his desk drawer and ran toward the door. His security team was probably in their quarters, unaware of what was happening outside in the storm. There was no time to alert them, no time to call for help. That child's scream echoed in his ears, and every second that passed felt like an eternity. As he stepped out into the storm, the full force of nature hit him like a physical blow. The rain soaked through his clothes instantly, and the wind nearly knocked him off his feet. But Michael pressed forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he made his way down the treacherous hillside. His expensive shoes slipped on the wet grass, and thorns from the wild bushes tore at his arms. But he didn't care about the pain. Someone needed help, and that was all that mattered. The path down to the road was steep and dangerous even in good weather. Tonight, with the rain turning the earth to mud and the lightning creating a deadly light show above, it was almost impossible to navigate. Michael fell twice, his hands scraping against rocks, his knees absorbing the impact of his tumbling body. But each time he heard that desperate cry for help, he found the strength to get back up and continue his descent. As he got closer to the crash site, the beam of his flashlight revealed the full horror of the situation. A small sedan had hit a patch of standing water, hydroplaned off the road, and slammed into a cluster of large boulders. The front end was completely crushed, steam rising from the broken radiator and mixing with the rain. The driver's side door hung open at an odd angle, and Michael could see a woman slumped over the steering wheel, motionless. But it was the sound from the back seat that had drawn him out into this nightmare. A little girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was trapped inside the wreckage. Her cries were becoming weaker now, and Michael realized with growing horror that she might be hurt badly. The car could catch fire at any moment, or the rising water from the creek could flood the interior. Time was running out. Michael reached the crashed vehicle and immediately began assessing the situation. The woman in the front seat was breathing but unconscious, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. The little girl in the back was conscious but terrified, her eyes wide with panic as she saw this strange man approaching through the storm. She didn't recognize him in the darkness, soaked and disheveled as he was. The realization hit him like another bolt of lightning. He was Michael Jackson, one of the most famous people in the world, and he was about to risk everything to save 2 strangers on a stormy night. If word of this got out, if photographers somehow appeared, if the media twisted this act of heroism into another scandal, his already fragile reputation could be destroyed forever. But as he looked into the frightened eyes of that little girl, he knew that none of that mattered. This was his moment to be the man he had always wanted to be. Not the king of pop, not a celebrity, but simply a human being who refused to let innocent people suffer when he had the power to help. Michael's hand shook as he approached the passenger side of the crumpled sedan, his flashlight revealing the extent of the damage. The metal had twisted like paper around the little girl, creating a cage of jagged steel and broken glass. Her small voice called out through the wreckage, weaker now than before, and Michael felt his heart breaking with each desperate word. "Mommy won't wake up," the child whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I can't move my leg, and it hurts so much." Michael dropped to his knees beside the car, not caring that the rocky ground tore through his expensive pants or that the rushing water from the swollen creek was beginning to pool around the vehicle. He positioned his flashlight so he could see inside and got his first clear look at the situation. The little girl had dark curls plastered to her head from the rain coming through the shattered windows, and her brown eyes were filled with tears and terror. "Hi there, sweetheart," Michael said softly, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring despite the panic coursing through his veins. "My name is Michael, and I'm here to help you and your mommy. Can you tell me your name?" The girl sniffled and wiped her nose with a muddy hand. "I'm Sarah," she said. "Sarah Martinez. We were driving home from my grandmother's house, and then the car started sliding, and everything went crazy." Michael's heart ached as he heard the fear in her voice. He knew that feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in a situation beyond your control. Throughout his own childhood, he had often felt powerless against forces much bigger than himself. But tonight, he had the power to make a difference, and he wasn't going to waste it. "Sarah, that's a beautiful name," he said, his voice gentle but urgent. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, okay? Your mommy is going to be fine. She's just sleeping right now because she bumped her head. But I need to get you out of there because the water is starting to rise." As if to emphasize his point, another surge of rainwater rushed down the hillside and pooled around the car. The creek, normally a gentle stream, had become a raging torrent in the storm. Michael realized with growing alarm that they had maybe 10 or 15 minutes before the rising water became a serious threat to both the unconscious mother and the trapped child. He tried the rear passenger door, but it was jammed shut from the impact. The frame had buckled, and no amount of pulling could budge it. The window was intact but spider-webbed with cracks from the collision. Michael looked around desperately for something to break the glass with, finally settling on a large rock from the creek bed. "Sarah, I need you to close your eyes and turn your face away from me," he instructed. "I'm going to break this window so I can reach you, but I don't want any glass to hurt you." The little girl nodded bravely and buried her face in her hands. Michael wrapped his shirt around the rock and struck the window with all his strength. The safety glass held for a moment, then suddenly gave way in a shower of tiny cubes that scattered harmlessly across the car's interior and onto the ground. Now he could reach Sarah, but getting her out would be the real challenge. As he shined his flashlight into the back seat, Michael could see that her left leg was pinned beneath a piece of twisted metal from the door frame. The metal hadn't cut her, but it was holding her firmly in place. To make matters worse, her seatbelt had locked during the crash and wouldn't release. "Okay, Sarah, I can see what's happened," Michael said, forcing himself to sound confident even though his mind was racing with worry. "Your leg is stuck, but I think I can get you free. It might hurt a little bit, but I promise I'll be as gentle as I can." The water was definitely rising now, creeping up the sides of the car like hungry fingers. Michael knew he had to work fast, but he also knew that one wrong move could seriously injure the child. He reached through the broken window and began carefully examining the twisted metal that held her leg captive. The piece of door frame had bent inward during the crash, creating a V-shaped trap that had caught Sarah's small leg just above the ankle. Michael realized that if he could somehow bend the metal back, he might be able to slide her leg free, but it would require incredible strength, and he would have to do it all while reaching through the narrow window opening. "Sarah, can you wiggle your toes for me?" he asked, trying to assess whether her leg was seriously injured. The little girl concentrated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I can move them, but it really hurts when I try to move my whole leg." That was both good news and bad news. Good because it meant her leg probably wasn't broken. Bad because it meant she was going to feel pain when he tried to free her. Michael took a deep breath and grabbed the twisted metal with both hands, his fingers immediately feeling the sharp edges cutting into his palms. He pulled with all his might, his muscles straining against the stubborn steel. At first, nothing happened. The metal seemed fused in place, as unmovable as the mountains themselves. But Michael thought about his own children, about how he would want someone to fight for them if they were in this situation, and he found reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. Slowly, incredibly slowly, the metal began to bend. Michael's hands were bleeding now. His expensive shirt was ruined, and his back felt like it might snap from the awkward angle, but he didn't stop pulling. Sarah watched him with wide eyes. This strange man, who had appeared out of the storm like an angel, sacrificing his own body to save hers. Finally, with a grinding screech of metal on metal, the trap opened enough for Sarah's leg to slip free. She cried out in pain and relief as feeling rushed back into her limb, but she was free. Now Michael just had to figure out how to get her out of the rapidly flooding car and up the treacherous hillside to safety. With Sarah's leg finally free from the twisted metal, Michael felt a surge of relief that was immediately replaced by a new wave of urgency. The water was now lapping at the bottom of the car doors, and he could hear the ominous creaking of metal as the current began to push against the vehicle. They had minutes, maybe less, before this rescue attempt became a recovery mission. "Sarah, I need you to be very brave now," Michael said, reaching through the broken window to unbuckle her seatbelt. His fingers worked quickly on the stubborn mechanism, made slippery by the rain and his own blood from the cuts on his hands. "I'm going to lift you out through this window, and then we're going to go help your mommy together, okay?" The little girl nodded, though Michael could see the pain in her eyes as she tried to move her injured leg. The adrenaline was probably the only thing keeping her from crying, and he knew that shock would set in soon if they didn't get her medical attention quickly. As gently as possible, Michael reached through the window and scooped Sarah up in his arms. She was so small, so fragile, and he could feel her trembling against his chest as he carefully maneuvered her through the opening. The broken glass scraped against his arms, adding new cuts to his growing collection of injuries, but he barely noticed the pain. All that mattered was getting this child to safety. Once Sarah was clear of the wreckage, Michael set her down on a relatively dry patch of ground near a large boulder. "I need you to stay right here for just a minute," he told her, his voice urgent but gentle. "I have to get your mommy out of the car, but I'll be right back. Can you do that for me?" Sarah nodded bravely, wrapping her arms around herself as the rain continued to pour down. Michael could see her shivering, and he wished he had something to cover her with, but there was no time for that luxury. The water was rising faster now, and he could see it beginning to seep into the car's interior through the gaps in the damaged doors. Michael splashed through the ankle-deep water to the driver's side of the vehicle. The woman, Sarah's mother, was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. The steering wheel had been pushed back toward her seat during the crash, pinning her in place, and her door was jammed shut, just like her daughter's had been. This rescue would be even more challenging than Sarah's had been. The woman was obviously heavier than her daughter, and Michael would have to extract her through a much smaller opening while working around the deployed airbag and the bent steering wheel. Moreover, he had to do all of this without knowing the extent of her injuries. Moving her incorrectly could cause permanent damage to her spine or internal organs. But as Michael looked at the rising water and felt the car beginning to shift slightly in the current, he realized he had no choice. If he left her in the vehicle, she would certainly drown. If he moved her incorrectly, she might be paralyzed, but at least she would be alive. He smashed the driver's side window with the same rock he had used before, then carefully cleared away the remaining glass with his bare hands. His palms were already cut up, so a few more lacerations didn't matter. What mattered was creating a clean opening that wouldn't cause additional injuries during the extraction. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Michael called out as he reached through the window to check her pulse. Her heartbeat was strong, which was encouraging, but she remained completely unresponsive. The cut on her forehead was still bleeding, and Michael could see what looked like the beginning of significant bruising around her left eye. Working as carefully as possible, Michael began the delicate process of freeing Sarah's mother from the wreckage. He had to deflate the airbag first, which released a cloud of powder that mixed with the rain and made everything even more slippery. Then he carefully worked to ease the steering wheel away from her body, using his own weight as leverage against the twisted metal. Every few seconds, he glanced back to check on Sarah, who was still huddled by the boulder where he had left her. The little girl watched his every move with wide, frightened eyes, and Michael tried to give her encouraging smiles whenever their gazes met. He needed her to stay calm and strong, because they weren't out of danger yet. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Michael managed to create enough space to begin extracting the unconscious woman. He slipped his arms under hers and began the slow, careful process of pulling her through the window opening. She was dead weight in his arms, and the awkward angle made every inch a struggle. Halfway through the extraction, the car suddenly lurched as the current caught it from a new angle. Michael felt his feet slip on the muddy creek bottom, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might lose his grip on Sarah's mother. But somehow, he managed to maintain his balance and continue the rescue. When the woman was finally clear of the vehicle, Michael dragged her to higher ground and quickly checked her vital signs again. Her breathing was still steady, and her pulse remained strong, but she needed medical attention immediately. The same was true for Sarah, whose injured leg was beginning to swell despite her brave efforts to ignore the pain. Michael looked up the dark hillside toward his house, then back at the two victims of the crash. The hardest part of the rescue was still ahead of them. He had to somehow get an unconscious adult and an injured child up a steep, muddy slope in the middle of a thunderstorm. His own strength was already flagging from the adrenaline crash, and his hands were so cut up that he could barely make a fist. But as he looked at Sarah's trusting face and her mother's peaceful expression, Michael Jackson found the resolve he needed. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to fail them now. The storm was still raging, the night was still dark, and the journey ahead would test every ounce of strength and determination he possessed. But sometimes, being a hero wasn't about having superpowers or special abilities. Sometimes, it was just about refusing to give up when people needed you most. The ascent up the rain-soaked hillside would haunt Michael's dreams for years to come. With Sarah's mother unconscious and the little girl unable to walk on her injured leg, he faced an impossible choice: leave one behind to get help for the other, or attempt to carry both up the treacherous slope in conditions that challenged even experienced rescue workers. There was no choice at all, really. Michael Jackson had never abandoned anyone in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. He fashioned a makeshift stretcher from his own torn shirt and some sturdy branches, placing Sarah's mother on it as gently as possible. Then he lifted Sarah onto his back, her small arms wrapping around his neck as she pressed her face against his shoulder. The little girl was shaking from cold and shock, but she trusted this stranger who had appeared from the darkness to save her family. "Hold on tight, sweetheart," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "We're going home." The first few steps up the muddy hillside nearly sent them all tumbling back down to the flooded creek. Michael's feet slipped repeatedly on the wet grass and loose rocks, and dragging the improvised stretcher while carrying Sarah required a level of physical coordination that seemed beyond human capability. His injured hand screamed in protest as he gripped the makeshift handles, and his back felt like it might snap under the combined weight. But with each step, Michael drew strength from an unexpected source: the memory of his own childhood performances. As a young member of the Jackson 5, he had learned that the show must go on no matter what. Whether he was sick, exhausted, or heartbroken, the audience needed him to deliver. Tonight, his audience was a terrified little girl and her unconscious mother, and failure wasn't an option. Lightning continued to split the sky, providing brief moments of visibility that Michael used to navigate around the worst obstacles. Thunder crashed overhead like the applause of an angry god, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. Every few minutes, Michael had to stop and rest, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. During these pauses, Sarah would whisper words of encouragement in his ear, her small voice giving him the motivation to continue. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," she said during one of their rest stops, her words barely audible above the storm. "Are you an angel?" Michael almost smiled despite their desperate situation. If only she knew the truth, that he was just a man, flawed and broken like everyone else, doing his best to be worthy of the trust she had placed in him. "No, sweetheart," he replied softly. "I'm just someone who couldn't bear to hear you cry." The climb became a blur of pain, determination, and small victories measured in feet rather than miles. Michael's expensive shoes disintegrated on the rocky terrain, leaving his feet cut and bleeding. His silk shirt, already torn and bloody, finally gave up entirely and hung in tatters from his shoulders. But with each step up the hillside, they moved closer to safety and medical help. About halfway up, disaster nearly struck. Michael's foot caught in a hidden root, and he fell hard, Sarah tumbling from his back as the stretcher slipped from his grasp. For a terrifying moment, Sarah's mother began sliding back down the hill toward the flooded creek. Michael lunged forward, ignoring the searing pain in his torn hands, and managed to grab the stretcher just before it disappeared into the darkness. Sarah had landed hard on her injured leg, and now she was crying in earnest, the brave facade finally cracking under the pressure of pain and fear. Michael crawled over to her, his own body screaming in protest, and gathered her into his arms. "I know it hurts, baby," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "But we're almost there. I can see the lights from my house. Just a little bit further, and we'll have you and your mommy safe and warm." It was true. Through the rain and darkness, Michael could make out the glow of Neverland Ranch's security lights. His home, his sanctuary, was less than 100 yards away. But those final yards would be the most challenging yet. The slope grew steeper as it approached his property, and his strength was almost completely spent. Drawing on reserves he didn't know he possessed, Michael lifted Sarah back onto his shoulders and grabbed the stretcher handles once more. His vision was blurring from exhaustion, and he could taste blood in his mouth, but he forced himself to take another step, then another. The security lights grew brighter with each agonizing step. Michael could see his house now, warm and welcoming in the storm, like a beacon calling them home. His security team would have medical training. They could call for ambulances, provide first aid, and take over this rescue mission that had pushed him beyond his physical and emotional limits. With 50 yards to go, Michael's legs finally began to give out. He stumbled and nearly fell, saved only by Sarah's quick thinking as she grabbed a low tree branch and helped steady them. The little girl had become his partner in this rescue, and together they half walked, half crawled up the final stretch of muddy ground. When they finally reached the flat lawn of Neverland Ranch, Michael collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw breath. Sarah rolled off his back and immediately crawled over to her mother, taking the unconscious woman's hand in both of hers. "Mommy, we made it," she whispered. "The angel brought us home." Michael looked at this brave little girl, then at her mother, then up at his house, where help was finally within reach. They had done the impossible. Against all odds, in conditions that would have defeated most people, they had climbed out of hell and made it to safety. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. Now came the race against time to get proper medical treatment and ensure that this night of heroism didn't end in tragedy. As Michael struggled to his feet and began stumbling toward his house to alert his security team, he realized that something fundamental had changed within him. For the first time in years, he felt like the man he had always wanted to be. Not a celebrity, not a performer, not a target for media attacks, but simply a human being who had refused to let innocent people suffer when he had the power to help them. The storm still raged overhead, but Michael Jackson walked through it like he owned the very lightning itself. The emergency vehicles arrived at Neverland Ranch like a parade of salvation, their red and blue lights cutting through the darkness as paramedics and police officers flooded onto the property. Michael watched from the warmth of his living room as Sarah and her mother were carefully loaded into ambulances, the little girl's eyes searching for him until the very moment the doors closed. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician at Ventura County Medical Center, would later tell reporters that both victims were extraordinarily lucky to be alive. Sarah had suffered severe sprain and minor lacerations, while her mother, Elena Martinez, had sustained a concussion and several broken ribs. But they would both make full recoveries, and the doctor credited their survival to the quick thinking and heroic actions of their rescuer. What the doctor didn't know What nobody except Michael's closest security personnel knew was the identity of that rescuer. The King of Pop had made them promise to keep his involvement secret, at least until he could figure out how to handle the inevitable media storm that would follow. As dawn broke over Southern California, Michael sat alone in his studio, the same room where the nightmare had begun just hours earlier. His hands were bandaged, his body ached from dozens of cuts and bruises, and his mind was reeling from everything that had happened. But despite the physical pain, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke on the morning news. Mysterious hero saves mother and daughter in storm rescue, read the headline in the Los Angeles Times. The media was desperate to identify the Good Samaritan who had risked his life to save two strangers, but so far, Michael's secret remained safe. His personal assistant knocked softly on the studio door, then entered with a steaming cup of tea and a worried expression. "Michael, there are reporters gathering at the main gate," she said quietly. "Word is starting to leak about your involvement. Sarah Martinez has been asking for you at the hospital, and she's been telling everyone about the angel who saved her family." Michael smiled despite his exhaustion. That brave little girl deserved to know the truth about her rescuer, even if the rest of the world never did. "Arrange for me to visit the hospital," he said. "Privately, if possible. I need to see how they're doing." 2 hours later, disguised in simple clothing and dark sunglasses, Michael walked through the pediatric ward of Ventura County Medical Center. The few staff members who recognized him had signed confidentiality agreements, and the hospital administration had cleared the corridor to ensure privacy for their famous visitor. Sarah was sitting up in her hospital bed, her injured leg elevated, but her eyes bright with excitement when she saw him enter the room. In the bed next to hers, her mother Elena was awake for the first time since the accident, looking tired but alert. "I knew you'd come back," Sarah exclaimed, reaching out her small arms for a hug. "I told everyone about how you saved us, but nobody believed me when I said you were Michael Jackson." Elena Martinez gasped, her eyes widening as she recognized the man who had risked everything to save her family. She had been conscious enough during parts of the rescue to remember fragments, strong arms lifting her from the wreckage, a gentle voice encouraging her daughter, the feeling of absolute safety despite the storm raging around them. "You're him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're really him. You saved our lives." Michael pulled a chair up between their beds and sat down, his bandaged hands folded in his lap. "I just did what anyone would do," he said simply. "I couldn't hear Sarah crying and not try to help." But Elena shook her head firmly. "No, that's not true. Most people would have called for help and waited for professionals. You risked your life, your career, everything, to save two strangers. Do you have any idea what this could mean if the media finds out? They'll twist it. They'll find ways to make it negative. "I don't care," Michael interrupted, and he realized with surprise that he meant it completely. "Let them say whatever they want. Let them twist it however they choose. I know what happened on that hillside last night, and so do you. That's all that matters." Sarah reached over and took his bandaged hand in both of hers. "Will you sing for me?" she asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. "My leg still hurts, and your voice always makes me feel better when I hear it on the radio." For the first time in months, Michael felt the familiar joy that music had always brought him. Not the pressure of performing, not the weight of expectations, but the simple pleasure of sharing a gift with someone who needed it. He began to hum softly, then gradually let his voice grow stronger as he sang an impromptu lullaby, something gentle and healing that seemed to flow directly from his heart. Other patients and staff members began gathering quietly in the hallway outside the room, drawn by the unmistakable voice that had touched millions of lives around the world. But this performance was different from any concert he had ever given. This was pure, unfiltered love, offered freely to a little girl who had shown him what true courage looked like. As Michael sang, Elena Martinez watched her daughter's face relax into the first peaceful expression she had worn since the accident. The fear was gone, replaced by wonder and joy. In that moment, the mother understood something profound about the man sitting beside them. Yes, he was Michael Jackson, the global superstar whose music had defined a generation. But more importantly, he was someone who understood that real heroism wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about showing up when people needed you most, regardless of the cost. When the song ended, Sarah was almost asleep, her small hand still clutching Michael's. Elena looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "How can we ever thank you?" Michael smiled, and for the first time in years, it was completely genuine. "You already have," he said softly. "You reminded me who I really am." As Michael prepared to leave the hospital, he made one final request to Elena Martinez. "If reporters ask about what happened, tell them whatever you want about the rescue. But please don't mention my name unless you absolutely have to. I want this to be about you and Sarah, about survival and hope. The world has enough stories about celebrities. It needs more stories about real heroes, like a little girl who stayed brave in the darkness and helped save her own family." Elena nodded, understanding completely. As Michael walked away down the hospital corridor, she realized that her daughter had been right all along. They had been saved by an angel, not the kind with wings and halos, but the kind that appears when you need them most, asking nothing in return except the chance to do what's right. The storm had passed, dawn had broken, and 3 lives had been forever changed by one night of courage, compassion, and hope. In a world that often seemed dark and cruel, sometimes all it took was one person willing to step into the storm and refuse to let the light go out. And sometimes that person turned out to be the last one anyone would expect, proving that heroism comes in many forms, and that the greatest performances happen when no one is watching, when there's no applause, and when the only reward is knowing that you answered the call when it mattered most.